Fallout is set in a retrofuturistic 1950s America that got nuked into oblivion. And if you know anything about 1950s America, you're probably wondering, does Fallout just, ignore all of that? The segregation and ugly history of mid-century America? Well, kind of. Let me explain. So first, the pre-war period. Fallout America in the lead up to 2077 is essentially the 1950s if it never ended. The Cold War never thawed out, but instead of the Soviet Union being the enemy, it was China. The Sino-American War replaced the nuclear standoff with an actual shooting war with resources. And here's where the racism question gets complicated. Fallout doesn't really portray traditional racism. Nobody's getting called slurs for being black or Irish or Italian. The games kind of quietly assume that those particular sins of the old world got resolved off screen somewhere between our timeline and theirs. And we'll come back to why they made that choice. What Fallout does instead is anti-Chinese paranoia, Sino-McCarthyism. The same energy that produced Japanese internment camps in our version of World War II. That specific brand of you look like the enemy so you are the enemy, or pointed towards Chinese and Chinese American people. And the games show you exactly what that looked like. There's a terminal at the South Boston military checkpoint in Fallout 4, dated October 11, 2077, 12 days before the bombs dropped. The entry is about a family called the Woos, Michael Woo, his wife Jennifer, and their son George. They got stopped at the checkpoint for a full inspection, which in this America meant soldiers literally dismantling your car and looking for contraband. They found nothing, leading the inspection leader to apologize, but the family, understandably so, got upset and started yelling. The entry says they were yelling in a foreign language, probably Chinese I assume, and so they were detained and the military police was called and the family was separated. 12 days before the end of the world, a family was getting their car taken apart and arrested for simply fighting back against the racial profiling. These people were not spies or even a threat, they were just simply Chinese. Now here's something that genuinely made me angry when I found out about it, because it's buried deep in the DLC. In Old World Blues, the New Vegas DLC set in the big MT research facility, there's a location called Little Yangtze. Before the war, Executive Order 99066 was used to round up Chinese and Chinese American citizens and put them in internment camps. Little Yangtze was one of those various camps. Little Yangtze wasn't really an internment camp either. It was a storage facility for test subjects. The scientists at Big MT used the Chinese Americans imprisoned there as unwilling experimental subjects. On the very first day of operations, 3 trainloads of prisoners arrived. Half of them couldn't even speak English. One of the Big MT scientists, Boris, based many of his experiments around the assumption that the prisoners were communist spies. He had no issues using them as test subjects and even had cyberdogs eat some of them. And so when the bombs finally dropped, the military abandoned Big MT and just left the prisoners there. The radiation turned the survivors into ghouls, and because the explosive collars on their necks were still active, they couldn't leave the camp and have been trapped inside that fence for over 200 years. Talk about a timeout, am I right, lads? Sorry, not the time and place. 200 years later, and they're still there because nobody ever came back to let them out, or simply because they were born of a race and ethnicity they didn't even choose. Not that them having a choice would make anything better, just pointing out how sadistic and absurd the concept of racism is. Sorry, quick detour here, but judging by the Amazon TV show, the absolute worst thing you could be in pre-war America, it was Canadian. America annexed Canada in 2076, and the show treats being Canadian the same as coming out as saying you're one of Lucifer's greatest allies, or if adjusted for modern audiences, basically a Trump meat rider. At least the Chinese were considered a serious enemy. Canada was more cynical than hellish. Sorry Drake, you're gonna have to sit this one out in Ontario. Just a quick side note, if you're enjoying the video so far, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button and like the video. Thanks. So here's the question. It's 1950s America. History says 1950s America had serious documented violent racism against Black Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and immigrants of all kinds. So why doesn't Fallout show any of that? I think there are a few reasons, and they're all pretty valid. The first one is pretty obvious. It would just be racist. Having your player character wander through a world where NPCs are dropping slurs at them for their ethnicity isn't any fun. Nobody playing Fallout wants to sit through that. And making it optional doesn't fix it at all. The second reason is gameplay. Real historical racism doesn't have a quest attached to it. It doesn't serve the story that Fallout is trying to tell. The game is about survival in a post-apocalyptic nuclear wasteland, not a history lesson about discrimination. Adding 1950s racism for authenticity would just be a depressing addition with absolutely no payoff. And this is the one I find genuinely interesting, is that if you gave the Enclave or Legion deeper, more specific racist lore, you'd end up with more concerning cosplayers. The people who already love the Enclave unironically for its fascist energy don't need to be fed with any more material. Fallout made a deliberate choice to keep that ideology vague enough that it clearly reads as villain behavior without creating a detailed framework for people to actually try and adopt it in real life. So instead, Fallout took all of that discriminatory energy and redirected it at fictional targets, ghouls and sins and super mutants, and in doing so made the same point more cleanly. Now this is where Fallout gets really interesting, because the prejudice it portrays after the real bombs drop is doing the same thing real prejudice does, just with different targets this time. Ghouls are humans. They were people when the bombs fell. Radiation changed their body and it didn't change who they were. And the wasteland treats them like monsters anyway. Gob is a ghoul bartender in Megaton in Fallout 3. His full name is Bartholomew. He was sold into slavery by raiders and bought by Colin Moriarty, who's been using him as a bartender for 15 years. The game's official guide describes him as skittish and nervous, always looking over his shoulder, doing his best to be friendly, mostly out of fear of being abused and beaten. When you first meet him, one of your dialogue options is to call him a disgusting freak, and he flinches. He's used to it. That reaction is that of someone so accustomed to being treated badly that kindness surprises them more than cruelty, and is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the franchise. Diamond City had ghouls living in it from its foundation in the 2130s, all the way to 2282. Then a man called McDonough ran for mayor on a platform called Mankind for McDonough. After his election, ghoul citizens were evicted, entire families thrown out of the city and into the surrounding ruins with nothing. Some died, and the ones who survived simply scattered. A refugee named Wise Man founded a settlement called the Slog, while others ended up in Good Neighbor. A politician ran on an explicitly anti-ghoul platform, won, and then used his position to expel an entire group of people from the only home they'd ever known, and the city just watched him do it. I don't know if you're starting to see parallels between this and real life. John Hancock, the ghoul mayor of Good Neighbor, was actually human when McDonough did this. He watched it happen from inside the city and was so disgusted by what he saw, the betrayal of people who were just trying to live their lives, that he voluntarily took experimental chems to become a ghoul himself. He wanted no part of being on the side that did that. So no, you are not just following orders. The Enclave is where Fallout gets as close to explicit fascism as it ever does, but Enclave's ideology is simple. They are the real Americans, pure and uncontaminated. Everyone else, ghouls, super mutants, saints, and any human who's been exposed to the slightest bit of radiation since the war is impure, subhuman, an abomination. And unlike most of the game's factions who at least acknowledge that ghouls are people, the Enclave just doesn't. The words mutie, zombie, and abomination get used in the games as slurs directed specifically at ghouls and super mutants, and they're most associated with Enclave and Brotherhood dialogue. The Brotherhood of Steel and Fallout 4 don't just dislike ghouls but actively purify them, a word they chose deliberately. And the Amazon show, the Brotherhood is shown killing non-feral ghouls, ghouls who are walking around thinking, talking humans, being killed by people in power armor, who decided that they simply don't deserve to live because they look a certain way. The Enclave goes further than everyone though. Their plan in Fallout 2 was to release a modified virus into the water supply that would kill every living thing contaminated by radiation since the war, everyone and everything, and then start again with the people they kept sealed away. Cleansing and purification, starting fresh with only the right kind of people. The game never calls it what it is by name. It doesn't need to. We can see it happening in our daily lives as I speak, and nobody is doing anything about it. But here's the thing though, by moving discrimination onto fictional targets, i.e. ghouls and super mutants, Fallout actually gets to show it more clearly than it could if it was depicting real historical racism. Because the player knows ghouls are people, you've talked to them, you've travelled with Raoul, you've seen what happened to Diamond City's ghoul families, you have all the information, and then the game shows you a society that has all the same information and still treats them as less than human. That gap between what you know and how society behaves is where the point lives. Fallout's racism is not subtle. The Enclave wants to kill everyone who isn't them. Diamond City voted for a man who promised to throw away its neighbors out. Gob has been a slave for 15 years because someone decided his face made that okay and justified. The games never tell you any of this is wrong. They don't need to. They just show you and trust you to feel it and make the right choice. That's what good science fiction does. It holds a mirror up sideways, and sometimes looking at something from an angle is the only way to actually see it. If this made you think about these games differently, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe. And yes, this video was a tad bit short, and it's because I'm traveling in a few days and didn't have much time talking this video. So drop a comment down below with the moment of Fallout that hit you the hardest on this stuff. I'm reading everything. See you, and thank you for watching.